Hello and welcome to another episode of Inside OUSD. I'm Communications Director John Sasaki, and we are very excited to be joined today by a former student, a graduate of Skyline High School, who is now at Harvard University. But there's some really special news we want to talk about. So please welcome Eleanor Wikstrom. Eleanor, it's so good to see you. It's been a few years. You've been doing big things in Cambridge, Massachusetts, haven't you?
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. It's certainly been a wild go of it, but I'm excited to be back and talking with you since it's been a couple of years, as you said.
Yeah. So before we go on, let me just ask you to kind of give us your history in Oakland.
Yes. So I was raised in Oakland. I was in the OUSD public school system for my entire academic career. So I went to elementary school at Sequoia. I went to middle school at Bret Harte. And then I rounded out at Skyline for the last 4 years. I graduated in the pandemic, but still, I think was incredibly blessed to have such a strong community around me for those 12 plus years that I was, going to school in Oakland.
And so, as I recall, you graduated in 2020.
Yeah.
So right after the pandemic started. Let's talk for a second just about what that whole experience was like as a high school senior. Your high school senior year kind of, in effect, ruined in a lot of ways. No prom, no like formal graduation like we normally do. That had to be a lot for a young person like yourself going through.
Yes, it definitely was. I think, a lot of my classmates and I were excited about the kinds of coming of age events that normally come with senior spring, like you mentioned, prom, graduation. And it was, of course, a big shock to kind of have that rug pulled out from underneath us at the last second, especially after so many years of spending. I'd been in the same district with a lot of these students for 12 plus years. And so it was disappointing for sure. But I think also at the same time, we realized that even as the pandemic was taking its hold and we couldn't graduate in person, we couldn't do these things in person, that we had everything that we needed, which was each other. It sounds really cliche, but at the end of the day, we were still able to put on a really meaningful virtual graduation where Tom Hanks was a commencement speaker for Skyline. So I still get to bring that out in conversation. I don't know if that would have been possible in person. And of course, as much as we're regretting not having maybe those smaller textures of everyday life where we got to run into each other in classrooms, it's still been fruitful to reconnect with people every time that I am back in Oakland. So those connections are still there. We're just finding new ways to transform them now that COVID is, it's lessened a bit and we can reconnect with people.
And then, kind of going along with what we've been talking about, when you went to Harvard in the middle of the pandemic, like right at the beginning of this kind of craziness that we've been doing the past few years. So what was your freshman year like, and how has the transition been in those years since once we kind of got beyond kind of the heart of the pandemic, if you will?
Right. So I started school. I went straight through. I know there's quite a few members of my class who took a gap year, but I went directly to Harvard starting in fall 2020. And at the time, everything was completely online, but thankfully they did allow freshmen to come onto campus. And so it was a kind of surreal college experience where there were no upperclassmen, there were hardly any people. Harvard Square is normally a pretty busy place, but you would just see other freshmen. And so it was beautiful in its own way because it meant that we were able to really form deep connections with other members of our class. I was fortunate enough to be able to find a group of people really early on. And I know that wasn't always the case for people going into virtual schooling and going to their freshman year. But I was able to, and so I got to form those deep connections. And then I came back sophomore fall and realized, oh my gosh, I have actually no idea what real college is like. And so it was a huge learning curve, a necessary humbling to realize that what we'd been experiencing as joyful and as fruitful as it was to have those people around and to be able to take classes that interested me, to then come back to campus and be like, oh, lunch takes 2 hours now because we're all chatting, versus in the COVID era, you kind of just like eat and do your food at the same time. So little things like that where we didn't realize how different the experience had been. But it did mean that it was so enriching for the next couple of years. Like I'm still learning things about what it means to be a college student, and I'm about to leave. And so overall, I would say it was certainly a hectic time. And I'm sure many students in OUSD who started some form of schooling, everybody who had to make that transition is realizing the kinds of things that they missed out on, but at the same time realizing that, at least in my case, I still had a very full experience. It just looked different when I came back.
So I have to call out you mentioned your history a little bit in OUSD, but you didn't mention a few things that are important, I think. And I'm just going to list, as I recall, this is just from a few years back, You were very successful in the Martin Luther King Rhetorical Fest, competing for years in that, as I recall, right? And you were also Vice Youth Poet Laureate for the city of Oakland. You were captain of your track team. You were captain of your cross country team. Is that also correct?
That's also correct.
That sounds like, Eleanor is a pretty impressive person. And your senior year, you were one of 2 CIF Student Athletes of the Year.
This is also correct.
So the fact that you ended up at Harvard, what is regarded as one of the, if not the premier university in the world, what's it been like being an Oakland kid at Harvard?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the beginning, I felt very blessed to be there. I know that when I first got in, it felt like a very big community event for that to happen, because it had been a while, I think maybe over a decade, since at least a student from Skyline. And I'm not sure about the rest of USD, but I know from Skyline, at least, I think it's been like 12 years or something since someone had gone. And so I knew that it was very much the product of every single teacher, every student that I'd been in class in, every community organization, from the MLK Rhetorical to the Poet Laureate program to the youth chorus, to all of these things that had made it possible for me to be there. When I got to Harvard, I also wanted to be okay, though, that if I got there and it ended up being way more difficult than I was expecting, that I was going to give myself the grace to understand, like, I'm coming from OUSD, and it's a very different experience than a lot of students who have been in prep school for their entire lives and are basically trained to get to Harvard and succeed. But I think I came and I found that I was surprisingly doing well. Like, I think it felt like the right place to be, largely because I did find a really strong group of friends as soon as I got there. But I think I was very gratified to know that coming from OUSD had given me a lot more, I think, perspective on the things that I was engaging with, versus perhaps more of an ivory tower understanding for students who didn't necessarily come from a school district that had quite as much international or diverse exposure as OUSD did. But then also that it gave me, I hope, a kind of groundedness in moving forward about what I want to do in the world, and making sure that it's ultimately to amplify the communities that I came from, rather than being like, oh, I made it to Harvard, let me forget about everything and everyone who shaped me in order to get me here.
Yeah, you come from one of those, the Johnson family of Long Island or something like that, right? I mean, did people ever say, "Oh, you're from Oakland? Oh, what's that?" Did they ask about being from our city?
They did, to some extent. It was never like explicitly kind of derogatory, but I think there's just a little bit more of a surprise where people would say, "Oh, from Oakland, oh, you must have gone to one of the private schools." Or, no, I came from OUSD, and I'm very, very proud of that. And so I think in a lot of I've done, ranging from my time on the Crimson to other organizations, I've really tried my best to, when that perspective is relevant, to emphasize the importance of recognizing that there is a lot of educational disparity in the ways that students get to Harvard. And I think it's one of those undercurrents. I mean, it's a conversation that we're all having in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, is what is Harvard and what is the role of other elite universities, and making sure that students from not traditional elite backgrounds can make it to Harvard. I will say that, of course, I was fortunate to come from like a stable economic background and a stable family. But that being said, there is a very distinct difference in the accessibility of Harvard to people who are not from one of those like private school circles.
Well, and you mentioned the affirmative action issue, and the Supreme Court did. And then there's also the other issue about legacy admissions to places like Harvard. And what's your perception of legacy admissions? That is, getting into a school because your parents got into the school, or your grandmother got into the school. What's your perspective on that, and how that impacts life at Harvard?
Right. I mean, I would say I'm anti-legacy admissions. I think that it should go. I think it must. And I think that's also something that increasingly students, including legacy students themselves, there's a really recent survey that the Crimson put out, and even students who are coming from legacy backgrounds were agreeing that needs to go, particularly in the aftermath of affirmative action. It's impossible to kind of square those two things, that you've just gotten rid of race-based affirmative action, and you're going to allow this backdoor that almost entirely benefits students from wealthy white backgrounds. That just you cannot do those two things at the same time. So I think that at Harvard, it's of course just kind of like an undercurrent of what goes on. I will say, though, that when coming from OUSD, when I first got in, I got a lot of cautions from people, like, be careful. They're like super rich out there, and they're racist, and a lot of these things. And I think that wasn't necessarily the Harvard that I found. Although, of course, I think that I appreciated people's warnings that it is just a very different scene. Like the Northeast, the wealthy Northeast is a very different scene than Oakland is. But that being said, I think that it it was something that I was able to navigate around. And then also form really fruitful friendships. Like students who are from those backgrounds are also like incredibly important and contribute to the community as well. But it's just something that I think we all need to be having that equity conversation. And we can do that while being very polite and being like, I don't want to comment on anyone's deservingness to be at Harvard because that's not my place. I'm not an admissions officer. But we do need to talk about the systemic issue that legacy admissions creates.
So before we get to your big news, I want to talk a little bit about your time at Harvard. You mentioned the Crimson. My understanding, that's the school newspaper, correct?
Yes, correct.
Tell me a little bit about what, as compared to all the things that you did in OUSD, what kinds of things have you done at Harvard? And go ahead and start with a question that I haven't asked in a very long time, I think. What's your major?
Yeah. So my major is called social studies, which sounds like a super, it's like that random class that you take in 6th grade and they teach you how to read a map. So it sounds really vague, but it's the interdisciplinary honors major in social sciences. And so you can take any class from government, history, economics, anthropology, and sociology. And you have a very broad training in social theory when you start, but you can take any class from those fields to build towards a thesis. So it is similar in some ways to grad doing a master's program where you know that you're going to contribute to the thesis in the end. But it's also really exciting because it means that every student in that course has a completely different focus field of study. And so when you're having conversations with people, the people ranging from looking at education equity to people looking at like political development in Latin America. And so I've had some of the most fruitful and exciting conversations and talking with the students.
Very cool. And so what else have you done? And tell us about your experience with Crimson.
Right. So Crimson has definitely been the largest chunk of my time at Harvard. I'm currently the editorial chair, which means that I run the opinion section. And so anything that goes through ranging from personal op-eds, so individual op-eds that people will write in response to a recent event, trying to shape the perspective of the community on one of those campus events, or board editorials. So I run the editorial board, which is a group of about 70 students who meet 3 times a week to opine on issues, to form positions on issues, and then write a group piece together. And so we're putting out 15 pieces a week, 3 pieces a day. So a lot of my time is spent at night just proofing and editing those pieces. I work with a fabulous co-chair, and I've been doing that for the past year and a half. So it's been a really big time. Prior to that, I was an op-ed editor, so I focused on that particular form of content. And then the year before that, I was a comp director, which is the Harvardism term for the person who kind of trains the incoming class. So that has been the most consistent part of my time, and also genuinely one of the most formative parts of my experience. I think it's taught me a lot about how do we have conversations about the things that are important to us in ways that will convince other people, but then also understand, the value and the importance of value of platforming certain voices, or when do you make decisions about will sharing this perspective cause more harm than good? And so a lot of those judgment questions I've been able to hone in conversation and community with my peers. But aside from that, I'd say the other major ones, although I'm happy to pause if all these questions. Okay, awesome. I also am currently one of the co-presidents of the Philippine Forum. So this is the Filipino Students Affinity Organization at Harvard. I've been co-president with my co-president for the past year. And so we did a lot of work to advocate for Tagalog or Filipino language courses at Harvard. Filipino is the 4th most spoken language and primary language in the United States. So it goes English, Spanish, Chinese, and Filipino. And yet most colleges around the country do not teach it. Most institutions around the country. And in fact, most history books don't even talk about the fact that the United States operated a colonial state in the Philippines for almost half a century. And so it's this major kind of like amnesia that exists in the United States' understanding about itself that I think is really deeply rooted in that colonial history. So working with my co-president, my peers, to raise a lot of that conversation about getting Filipino offered, which we did this past fall. I'm actually enrolled in it now, which has been a wonderful experience. But we also run an educational trip to kind of fill the gap of a lot of institutional knowledge about the Philippines. And so we'll bring students to the Philippines and do an immersion trip. And then I would say the last thing that was probably the most major part of my experience at Harvard was I came to Harvard and I walked on the track and field team. I stayed there for a year. During that year, it was during COVID. And so we didn't have competitions. I was just training with people, which was a really wonderful experience. And it was very similar to what I had done in high school, which, as you mentioned before, I was one of the captains of the track team and I had been involved in that all for years. And I ended up sophomore year when full competition resumed. I mean, Division I athletics is an incredibly major commitment, and I have absolute respect for all my peers who continue with that. I just felt that I wanted to focus on other things, particularly the Crimson. And so I've continued running on my own. I just ran a marathon. I'm going to run the Boston Marathon next spring. But that's probably been the biggest change in terms of my time commitments coming from Skyline.
Very nice. And then tell us real quick what all of this that you've done is kind of guiding you towards. What are you looking to do in life?
Right. That's the big question, right? No, I would say that what I'm hoping to do is pursue research that focuses on how do we create systems of knowledge, whether that is in education, whether that is in social media, whether that is in kind of policy decisions about these two fields, that amplify and uplift voices that have historically been marginalized. Because I think this is not just a question. I mean, it is absolutely a question of how did that produce enduring inequality, like enduring economic and social inequality, but it's also a question of what kinds of innovation and kinds of possibilities of knowing and producing new thought in the world are constrained by the fact that, at least in the form of my research, but because of the fact that colonial history has kind of determined whose knowledge is considered value and whose knowledge is considered valuable. And so I want to do that by continuing to do historical research. So I'm going to Oxford to study imperial history and U.S. history. There is no course on U.S. imperial history, basically anywhere in the world. So I'm kind of jigsawing those two things together by studying both things and putting them one next to the other. But on top of that, I'd also want to make sure that I'm continuing to engage with community organizations who are having these conversations outside of academia. It's not that they're not being had. It's just that they're being had in different institutions. And that's something that I think OUSD really taught me, was that there's such a strong history of community organizing that it's time to form those partnerships between community orgs who are amplifying these communities, and then also academia. And then I'd also like to continue doing public-facing research and writing. I did a lot of writing, kind of discussing and explicating Harvard's role in colonialism in the Philippines and how that connected to the fact that it didn't have a Filipino language course. And so as I continue to do this research, I'd want to make sure that, even if I am in academia, that I'm continuing to write books or write pieces that will engage community members and everybody else for whom awareness about this history would be beneficial.
That's a lot. I mean, the breadth that you're talking about there is amazing, but that kind of speaks to your next step. Now, you just mentioned Oxford. So what is the big news you found out within the past week or two?
So I found out a week and a half ago that I was selected as one of the American Rhodes Scholars. So the Rhodes Scholarship that's a fully funded scholarship to study at Oxford for 2 years. They select 32 students from across the United States, I think. So you apply through your university first. If you get endorsed, you then make it to the national round. So I think there's a couple thousand or something like that who are on to the national round. And then they pick 16 finalists for each district. So I flew back to Oakland last weekend, and I stopped by Skyline actually to pop by the track team or the cross country team's practice really quickly. But after that, the next day, I had an interview and found out later that day that I had been selected as one of the scholars.
So I admit I don't really know much about the Rhodes Scholar program or anything, but I think it's 32 from the United States, and then there are like a total of 100 from around the world.
Sure. Yeah.
100 people from around the world who's getting this remarkable education. It really is kind of like an academic royalty, if you will. I mean, I think that anybody who's pursues the kind of breadth of knowledge that you are pursuing, kind of has that as maybe the pinnacle of what they could do. Not necessarily that they pursue it, but that really is what a lot of people think of it. I mean, the only other Rhodes Scholar that I can think of just offhand is Rachel Maddow, who's on MSNBC. She's from Castro Valley. She's a brilliant mind on TV. And to be perfectly honest with you, when I heard this about you and talking to you, especially about things that you're discussing, I'm like, you could easily be a commentator on MSNBC. Is that like that kind of pursuit? Is that something, politics, that kind of world, something that you're thinking about too?
I think I have certainly been interested in how, and asking the question of how can I make sure that my research or the work that I'm doing does actually produce change, and that I'm am talking with the right people and having conversations at the right level where they'll land just beyond the circle of research that I'm doing. So I'm flattered by the commentator suggestion, and I think maybe the more likely route that would happen is if I do end up becoming relatively well known in my field of history, that when there are questions about like how does this change in geopolitical relations between the US and China and the Philippines in the middle, what does this mean from a historical perspective, then I could hop in as someone with kind of that historical expertise and shape public perception about that, or just kind of raise public awareness about the historical dimensions of it. So something like that for sure.
So tell me what it felt like to find out. And the timing is interesting. You did the interview and then like an hour later, they told you that. So tell me what it was like to receive that call. Find out that you got that scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, so it was a wonderful weekend. It actually started with the reception on Friday night. So you just kind of walked around, you got to meet the judges, you got to meet the other finalists, and then we drew lots from a hat, actually, like on paper slips to decide what times we were going to go interview. And so I interviewed in that morning, and then they interviewed basically for 12 hours straight throughout the day. And then they asked us all to come back and wait while they were deliberating. And so I was playing board games with my other finalists when they said that they're going to be coming up in 5 minutes, and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, we have to clean up. Like it looks like a mess in this room." But it was a really good bonding experience because they're also just such incredible people that they just amassed in one room. So it was truly an honor to like be in that room and sitting with them while we were all waiting. But then they came up and they announced the names of the two winners, which were myself and another student from Harvard, Aishania Tresh, who's from Saratoga. And we happened to be standing right next to each other. And so we just looked at each other and gave each other a big hug. And I think it was pretty surreal. I got a little lightheaded. I was fortunate that I was wearing like heels that didn't have a super tiny point because I think I would have fallen over. But no, it was genuinely just, I think I felt immensely grateful in that moment. And also not one of the judges, but one of the administrators who was on the back end and kind of just like, babysitting us because he had to make sure that we were all, like minding our business while the judges were deliberating. But he actually graduated from Skyline. And so we had a really fruitful conversation while we were waiting just about like our experiences with OUSD and the way that we felt that informed what we're choosing to do now. And so I think that it just happened. It was a beautiful coincidence that he happened to be there as well. And and we got to talk right after. And he was really, honestly, like I hadn't cried anything until that point, until he said like, OUSD is really proud of you. And that meant a lot to me.
There's no question that OUSD and Oakland are very, very proud. No doubt about that. So we're all 100 of this year's Rhodes Scholars informed that day in that location, or was it just the American?
Just the American ones, yeah. So it's every scholar or every American interview happens on that Friday, Saturday timeline, and then. So we were finding out actually throughout the day because obviously California is on the later end of the time zones. And so we were the last district to announce. And so everybody was getting texts from their friends like, oh, Detroit just announced, Florida just announced and stuff like that. So that is the nice thing though, is that you interview and then they tell you the same day. So it's not the same kind of like, excruciating waiting process that a bunch of other scholarships and things have.
And so are you now best friends with this young person from Saratoga?
Not yet, but it's very possible. She's a wonderful person, and we're going to be spending the next few years together. So I'm excited definitely to be able to form stronger connections with the students that I know that are going, just because they're all incredible.
Yeah, excellent. When, if you don't mind my digging a little bit on this, when did you first get the idea of even applying for the Rhodes Scholarship?
That's a good question. I mean, I didn't know what it was in high school. I think. It's not something that lives rent free in our minds in the way that it does, I think, for a lot of students who are growing up in really elite areas where, there's like a smattering of Rhodes Scholars here and there. And so I think I didn't know what it was until maybe 2 or 3 years into Harvard, when someone that I knew got one. And it's also something that is a little bit more apparent at Harvard just because a lot of students are applying and also a lot of students end up getting it. And so I think I started seriously considering it probably this spring, junior spring. There's a lot of fortunate academic accomplishments that took place that spring. And so I felt like I was in a good position to at least put my foot forward and see how that was going to go. And so then throughout the summer, I think the first kind of application round, at least for Harvard's endorsement end, that was due in August. And then I found out about the next round in September, and then another in October. And then I found out that I was invited to interview 2 weeks before the interview actually took place. So it was a pretty quick turnaround to kind of get that flight and come back. So it's been a pretty long process for sure. But I'm glad that it, worked out the way that it did.
Are you as impressed as everybody else is?
I just think that I happen to be in the right place at the right time.
Okay. The humility is great. That's downplaying it a bit, I'd say.
I mostly just feel incredibly grateful. I think that I want to recognize the work that I've done, of course, but I also think that there's a lot of contingency that took place to get me to where I am, and so I also want to be just very, very understanding of that as well.
Fair enough. Appreciate it. But in your view, what does being a Rhodes Scholar after graduating from Harvard University, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, the application process is somewhat intensive because you're writing multiple rounds of applications. You're doing this interview that is probably it's a 20-minute interview, but it's the most intense 20-minute interview of your life. You're like defending not every single, but your choice of study, any position that you've articulated in like an application. They will press you on it and ask you to think about it in a different context, ask you to defend it. And so throughout that process, you're getting really good at articulating why you want to do the things that you do. And also it's a good way to see, like, are people genuine about genuinely wanting to fight the world's fight? And so I think that for me, it's the beginning of the next chapter of making sure that whatever good that I want to do in the world, which is probably something that I feel was really, really honed and cultivated in OUSD, and also found other ways to work with that when I got to Harvard. Just seeing the best ways that I can continue to move that forward when I get to Oxford.
Very cool. And so this is an all expenses paid. You get a master's or something through this, or it leads to an.
I'll be getting 2 masters. I mean, you can do, other students will be getting the first couple of years of a DPhil, which is like the UK version, Oxford version of PhD. But I'm going for 2 masters.
In what?
The first one will be in global and imperial history, and then the second one will be in US history.
Gotcha. And that's how you're merging. I see. Yeah. I did see a post. Maybe it was a post that you shared on LinkedIn. Was there something significant about the Filipino American community with regard to you getting a Rhodes Scholar as well?
I think it was significant a lot just because my work at Harvard had focused on getting Filipino offered. And I'm definitely not the first Filipino American, but I think that there's a handful of us. Yeah.
Can you name other, famous Rhodes Scholars?
Pete Buttigieg was a Rhodes Scholar. I'm pretty sure Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a lot of really prominent academics who are Rhodes Scholars. I think now that you're asking, I'm blanking on all of them, but there's a collection. Yeah. All
right. So just in wrapping this up, I want to ask you real quick. Yeah, here in OUSD, we know, not every kid is going to Harvard. Not every kid is going to college. And obviously we want as much as possible for our kids to succeed in life, whether it's through college or, trade schools or any other thing between. Obviously we want everybody graduated from high school and being successful in life and whatever they choose to do. What's your advice to our young scholars, from the perspective of someone who's had as much success as you academically?
I think something that was really important for me was pursuing things that I was genuinely interested in an academic sense. I think beginning in OUSD, that does also require, though, from the start, just putting in that kind of daily mundane effort that it takes to get through your classes. Like, do actually do all of the readings and the assignments, and things that seem really petty and trivial at the time. That the accumulation of that and the sum of that is what will get you to be able to be at the point where you can say, well, now I can choose what I really want to do. And I think that's been an important thing for me, where that I've never felt that I've pursued something because someone else was telling me to, or because it seemed like the kind of economically viable next step. Go into academia is not the most economically viable next step, so I'm obviously not doing that. But I think that it's those two things at once, where you should do your best to cultivate some kind of innate sense of what really moves you and to lean into that, whether that is art, whether that is computer science, whether that is history. but also that requires you to have this foundation of making sure that you show up every day and do these little things and be present in your classes and with your friends and with your teachers. And those two things go hand in hand.
And I was just going to ask you, how important is good attendance for students?
It's incredibly, that's the baseline and the backbone of everything. It is one of those things that feels really petty. And that's something that running teaches you really well, right? Is that you just simply need to put your foot forward, like one foot in front of the other every single day. You might have the worst run of your life one day, but you have to still do it. And it's the same thing with going to class. Like you might be tired, you might be exhausted. You might have just had some, something else go on in your life. And of course, there's times when you need to make sure that you are prioritizing your recovery and your health. And so like if you're sick, make sure that you're taking care of yourself. But that being said, on those days when you can show up, you must show up. And that is how you build the foundation for everything else going forward.
Very good. All right. Eleanor Wikstrom, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of InsideOUSD. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next time for another episode of InsideOUSD.